let's look at what Iran's ideological goals are, right? It's not necessarily to have a nuclear weapon. That furthers the goal. That's not the goal in and of itself. Iran's objective is what has been called exporting the revolution. They want to project power outside of their borders. They don't have a nuclear weapon yet. And yet Iran has set the region on fire. For over a decade, Iran was dominant in the region. And what is the critical component that led to that dominance? It's Hezbollah. Because if you look everywhere that Iran has gone, has projected power, has asserted control, Hezbollah has been there first.
Over the last 2 years, the Middle East has changed faster than anyone expected. Hamas launched the October 7th massacre. Hezbollah opened the second front against Israel. Iran attacked Israel directly. Syria has entered a new chapter. And today, the United States is trying to broker a new framework between Israel and Lebanon. A deal some are calling historic. But is it? Has Hezbollah actually been weakened? Is Iran actually losing its grip on the region? Or are we witnessing the beginning of an entirely new phase of this conflict? Today's guest has spent years studying Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran, and the broader Middle East. His analysis has become essential reading for policymakers, journalists, and military and analysts trying to understand what comes next. He is a senior fellow at FDD, focused on Lebanon and Hezbollah. David Daoud, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
So today, everyone is talking about the new U.S.-backed framework between Israel and Lebanon. Is this the beginning of peace or simply another agreement that obviously Hezbollah never intends to honor?
Well, there's two sections there. Let's start with the Hezbollah part because I think that's the easier part to address, ironically. No, Hezbollah has no intention of honoring this or any other deal that has required its disarmament. I think this deal, Hezbollah finds it particularly egregious because it was signed in a manner where Lebanon, to some degree, lent credibility to Israel's existence, right? Lent of its credibility to Israel's existence. There was some element of normalization, even as the Lebanese ambassador, I mean, in the press conference we saw, refused to make eye contact with her Israeli counterpart, refused to even say the word Israel, which I think is discouraging. I mean, with all the caveats of what she has to deal with Lebanon's political situation, if Lebanon is, as she asserts, or Lebanon has, as she asserts, changed so fundamentally, then why can't you make eye contact on camera with an individual that everyone knows you've been negotiating with this person? And I go back to the first meeting between Ambassador Yasser Leiter and Ambassador Ahmadi, where, Lebanese media made such a hubbub about whether the ambassador, if you recall, the first photo op between them, both ambassadors were standing next to each other. I think there was like a breach of protocol that led to that or something. And Lebanese media made such a big deal over whether she'd shaken his hand or not. And rest assured, she did not. So everyone can go home calmly. So it's not, Hezbollah, but the very presence of a Lebanese ambassador next to an Israeli ambassador, the very presence of a Lebanese flag next to an Israeli flag, this lends legitimacy to Israel's existence. And this is something Hezbollah does not sanction. It runs contrary to their ideology, their very raison d'etre, right? It's not just about liberating swaths of South Lebanon, as they put it, but if you go back to the 1985 open letter, the liberation of the liberation of South Lebanon, let's be honest, is a precursor to Israel's removal from existence. This is me quoting. So that element particularly irks Hezbollah, not because it necessarily poses, these negotiations in and of themselves pose more of a threat to Hezbollah, but because that element undermines part of Hezbollah's worldview and ideology. Now, when it comes to the weapons issue, look, this is, the framework agreement. I've read through it. I've yet to have a chance to read through the security annex. I think Bloomberg had a piece that just came out on the security annex, which has so far been kept secret. So I'll get back to you on that, on what it entails. But the framework agreement, it's a good document, right? It's a great document, just like the November 27th, 2024 ceasefire agreement was a great document, just like Resolution 1701, which ended the Israel-Hezbollah war, was a great document. If we take all of these documents in isolation from real-world circumstances, namely what's going on in Lebanon, whether Lebanon can fulfill the deal, right? Because enforcement ultimately devolves upon Lebanon as the sovereign. And the question is whether Lebanon can fulfill the deal. And Hezbollah is saying, we're not going to abide by this. We're not going to willingly surrender our arms. They've been saying this, for since their inception. But after Resolution 1701, they made it very clear, right? They were remaining armed. The May 2008 incidents, where even where the government tried to seize Hezbollah's telecommunications network, and Nasrallah came back and said, "We will cut off the hand that is raised against the resistance." I mean, Naim Qassem has been a little bit softer in how he's framed things since he's become Secretary General, but the message is the same. You're not taking our arms, we're not surrendering our arms. So the only avenue left for Lebanon, realistically, I mean, there's an unrealistic avenue, which is dialogue and consensus, right? Sitting there and talking to Hezbollah and asking Hezbollah nicely, will you disarm? And that's failed, even though Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and President On, even after Hezbollah restarted the conflict on March 2nd, seemed insistent on pursuing this path. And the LAF seems also insistent on preserving domestic peace and tranquility, which is a code word for not clashing with Hezbollah. The other alternative is coercive disarmament, and Lebanon does not seem willing to do that. Now, that brings me to the first point you raised. Is this a pathway to peace? Look, I'm not someone who is excited about Israel-Lebanon peace. I think it's pie in the sky at this point. I'm not a very excitable person in general. But on this one, I think the benefits would accrue largely to one side. You even look at the Lebanese advocates for Israeli-Lebanese peace, and what they're saying is, look how much we can benefit from Israel. And my question is, well, what will the Israelis benefit, right? This should be a mutually beneficial agreement, after all, not one where Lebanon uses Israel as the latest crutch to kind of, reinvigorate its failing economy and solve all of its domestic problems, rather than go through the fundamental changes necessary to make Lebanon a not failing state. So what are the benefits that accrue to Israel? That's point one. Point two, if we're talking about a country that has historically, not just since Hezbollah's rise, but historically been unable to properly control its territory and borders. Right? Hezbollah is a symptom of that. It is not a cause of that. So what does it mean to have peace between Israel and Lebanon, where you're talking about a country that cannot control its borders, right? Take Hezbollah out of the equation for a certain point. Does this mean Israelis can go to Beirut safely? Does this mean that they won't be open to risk from not just Hezbollah, but any of the other armed actors that either operate in Lebanon? You have Hamas presence in Lebanon, PFLP. You have other Lebanese actors that are hostile to Israel and Israelis and Jews. I mean, you have the SSNP, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, which is effectively the local Nazi party and does not even play the distinction between Jews and Zionists, right? They make it very clear the Jew is their enemy in those words. So what does it mean to have Jews walking the streets of Beirut? Will the security forces be willing to protect them? I'm not worried about the government. I'm worried about the average person on the street. Or, you have other actors from Iraq and elsewhere that can come in if somehow Beirut becomes a hub of Israeli tourism, because there is this fantasy in Israel about eating hummus in Beirut, which I frankly don't understand. But if this becomes a hub of Israeli tourism, you're a bad actor. There's a government that is unwilling or unable to control its territory. Is this an easy area for you to go harm Israelis or kidnap Israelis? And the third factor, what does Israeli-Lebanese peace mean if Hezbollah remains armed or active? How could that operate, right? Compound the problem I just mentioned with a Hezbollah problem. I mean, imagine a situation where, as Ambassador Yahya Leiter said after the first meeting, he wants to see a situation where people are crossing the border both ways in business suits and bathing suits. Okay, well, what happens when Lebanese come to Israel under the best of intentions, right? To work, to do business, to do tourism, to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, and then go back to Lebanon, where the state does not reign supreme, where you have other actors that can, put pressure on them to reveal what they saw. Hey, what did Tel Aviv look like on the ground? What did Jerusalem look like on the ground? What did, Machane Rabin look like? What's around it? What's the security situation there? Tell us or we'll harm you. Tell us or we'll harm your family. And again, that tourist himself doesn't necessarily have to be maliciously motivated, but he's vulnerable once he goes back to Lebanon, or she's vulnerable when they go back to Lebanon. So that's all the practical. The other part is, and this is something, I think Israelis need to understand. The average Lebanese does not want peace with them. The average Lebanese may want Hezbollah's disarmament. I think there's, polling has shown that, something like 70% of Lebanese want to see a state monopoly on arms. Perhaps, when you break down that number, what does that actually look like? They might want to see some concessions from Israel as part of Hezbollah's disarmament. Maybe they don't want to give Israel a freebie, as they say it, or as they see it. So there is this consensus on, Hezbollah's arms outside of the Shia community. But, at the same time, you ask that average Lebanese, well, how do you feel about Israel? Do you want peace with Israel? And they'll say no, right? The average Lebanese will probably look at Hezbollah and Israel as two bad actors. They don't want war with Israel, right? I even say that most of Hezbollah's supporters, right, who aren't hardened ideologues, these are people who, mistakenly think that Hezbollah is their avenue or their vehicle for quiet. Right? They've bought into the idea that Israel is this rapacious entity, this usurping entity that just wants to kill and murder them. And look, the Israelis have not exactly been, smart in how they've dealt with Lebanon, to say the least. Right? There have been Israeli actions and statements over the years that have lent to this fear, and then Hezbollah takes it and magnifies it, right? And says, Israel just wants to come kill you. And if it weren't for us being strong, Israel would come kill you. So your avenue for quiet, we are not the problem, we are the avenue for quiet. Right. But you go and you ask that average Hezbollah supporter, who's probably secular, who's probably, just an average Lebanese, do you hate Israel? They'll say yes. Do you want to see Palestine liberated from the river to the sea? Probably. Do you want to even have a scratch on your roof to pay that price? Absolutely not. Right. I have enough problems. And that's kind of the consensus in Lebanon. I have enough problems. Whatever they think of ideologically of Israel, I have enough problems. I don't want war. That's good enough. Right. That's good enough from my perspective. And I think that's where the focus should be, not creating peace right now, because look, there has been a lot of bloodshed between both sides. And this isn't to, put a value statement on who's right and who's wrong. At the end of the day, humans aren't rational beings. We are emotional beings, and we don't look at things through the prism of pure reason. So in a state of war, you can understand how the Lebanese have their own set of grievances, some justified, some not, rationally, objectively speaking. But there's a lot of blood going both ways. There's a lot of suspicion going both ways. I think what we should aim for through these negotiations is creating a situation where we have 20 years of quiet, right? 20 years of genuine quiet, not the quiet that existed. I mean, look, here's the absurdity. I served in the Second Lebanon War in Tzanchanim, right? I was in South Lebanon. And, the absurdity is that children that were born then, while I was in South Lebanon, were fighting in the same villages, 20 years on. It's an absurdity. The issue wasn't resolved, right? So there was no real quiet in that time, even though there was an active war. Hezbollah was arming, Israel was preparing for the next conflict. So the situation now should be fundamentally different so that my children don't end up in those villages, that no one's children ends up in those villages fighting on both sides. And that requires Hezbollah's disarmament in a situation where, I don't know if you've ever been up to the border with Lebanon. Some people's backyards are, Lebanese territory, basically, right? You can see each other up close and personal, and vice versa, right? After, I'm a U.S. citizen, obviously. I visited Lebanon in 2008 and 2010, and I've seen the border from both sides, and you can literally see each other from the border. And the way to achieve peace is to create a situation where, for years, a Lebanese farmer whose own backyard is an Israeli's backyard, so to speak, can look across the border and can see an Israeli farming or going about their business and thinking, what did they just sprinkle on their tomatoes? I wonder if I should put that on my tomatoes, right? And vice versa, where an Israeli in northern Israel looks northward, doesn't see Hezbollah flags, doesn't hear, the sound of digging underground, doesn't see threatening posters in poor Hebrew, but in Hebrew nevertheless, that's meant to intimidate northern Israel, doesn't have laser pointers flashed into their home, doesn't have all of this compounded with the terror that was created by October 7th, a terror that was, the concept of October 7th was created by Hezbollah, and where they can look northward, see a Lebanese flag on a border post and think nothing of it, think, "Oh, that's fine. That's not, it's not lack of state control. That's actually state control." Can see a shepherd crossing by the border, tending to his flock, and not wonder, is that a Hezbollah lookout or is that a shepherd? It's just a shepherd. That situation for 20 years, no bloodshed, no suspicion, no arming, no preparation on both sides. That is the condition necessary to create peace. That's down the road. Right now, let's create genuine quiet for both sides because I think both sides finally deserve it.
Yeah. Now, everyone keeps saying that Hezbollah has been devastated. It's been 2.5 years of war. We took out their leaders. They've been pounded. But are they wrong? I mean, how much of Hezbollah is still left? And do we need to get rid of all of them in order to live in peace?
Well, so two things can be true at once. Hezbollah has suffered significant damage in the nearly 3 years they've been at war with Israel. Look, they went into this war thinking it would be a short order. And Naim Qassem, then Deputy Secretary General, now Secretary General, goes on NBC in April of 2024 and says, "We didn't expect this to last this long." Right? They miscalculated and underestimated Israel's reaction to October 7th, the unity that Israelis could muster after October 7th in light of the controversial figure of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. And the country was tearing itself apart for almost a year prior over the judicial overhaul. So I think this took them by surprise. The Israeli tenacity and relentlessness took them by surprise, and they got stuck. And mind you, this is April 2024. This is before Israel did the pager attack, decapitated the Radwan force, killed Nasrallah, destroyed something like 80% of their strategic arsenal. So Hezbollah has already been suffering. They didn't want this war. They thought they could, have their cake and eat it too. So Israel did deal them significant damage. And then it continued to deal them significant damage for 15 months, even though Hezbollah said on September 27th, rather, of 2025, Naim Qassem, it's the anniversary of Nasrallah's death, saying our regeneration, effectively, he said, our regeneration is outpacing Israeli operations. We're regenerating. And this is the question. This is the issue. And then 2 weeks later, you start to see the Israelis effectively confirming this and reporting, right, that the scale of attacks that Israel was conducting up until that point had not been enough. So the question isn't just diminishing Hezbollah, right? That's an accomplishment. The question is, how do you keep them diminished? And that's always been the problem, that keeping them diminished ultimately has to depend upon Lebanon, because, if we take the IDF's, you have a side here, the Israelis, that are willing to take on Hezbollah entirely, to dismantle Hezbollah. The lives of their citizens depend upon it. You cannot leave this problem metastasizing on your border for another few decades until you have another October 7th, this time from the creators of the October 7th concept, right? Or anything other than that. I mean, even anything short of October 7th, why should your families live in perpetual fear of an enemy north of the border when you really have no quarrel with Lebanon, even if you don't have the necessary components for peace with Lebanon, even if you have disagreements with Lebanon? Right, those disagreements can be resolved through other means. So the Israelis have the willingness to do this. The problem is they don't have the capability. The IDF is an army of something like 635,000 total personnel, right? And I like to remind people this isn't just combat troops, right? This includes military secretaries. This includes entertainment troops. This includes the cooks. This includes, every single component of the IDF, and the combat troops are much smaller. And if you haven't heard, Israel is experiencing a manpower shortage. If people have been watching Israeli news, there are clashes within Israel. There's massive tension now within Israel over the recruitment of Haredim into the IDF because the IDF needs the manpower, and the ultra Orthodox don't serve by and large, right? So you have an army that is small by nature. You have a manpower shortage that is compounded by having been on the war footing for 3 years. This is unprecedented in the IDF's history to have fought a war for this long, this intense, this long. The other war that lasted this long was the war of attrition with Egypt after the Six-Day War, but that was very low intensity. It wasn't this sustained, these distances and so on and so forth. So the IDF is drained. Israel's political capital globally is drained, and the IDF is a small army, and they would have to occupy territory, not just South Lebanon, right? Because you have South Lebanon, southern Beirut, and the Bekaa Valley, right? All the way up to northeastern Lebanon. So you'd have to occupy those territories and the territories in between to reach those territories. You'd have to maintain that occupation, logistical lines, so on and so forth, in hostile territory that is much larger, say, than Gaza. We see the difficulty the IDF is experiencing in Gaza with doing that, or did experience with Gaza doing that, right? This is a territory order of magnitude larger for however long to dismantle Hezbollah. It's just simply not digestible for the IDF. So this has to devolve upon Lebanon, which is the sovereign. But is Hezbollah's disarmament the necessary precondition? Yes, absolutely. There's no way that Hezbollah remains armed and you have distinguished that from, deceptive quiet. And what you have to do is not just degrade them, which has happened significantly. It is to cut off their pathways to regeneration, right? If we look at Syria, yes, the situation has changed, but you have a government there that is now struggling to consolidate control over its territory, that has, internal conflict, ethno-sectarian conflict. You have centrifugal forces pulling away from the new government in Damascus. And those are exactly the types of conditions that Iran and Hezbollah like to play with to maintain their exploitation of a country. And we know, because Syrian authorities have seized weapons and financial shipments to Hezbollah, they're continuing to use the country, diminished, but they're continuing to use the country to pass weapons and funds through from Iraq through Syria into Lebanon. Lebanon is not clamped down totally. I mean, you look at the recent FPV threat that is bedeviling the IDF, right? These are cheap drones that can be bought, online, either in whole or in part. Some of the components can be produced domestically. And if we look at the 15 months during which the IDF was operating prior to just the post November 27, 2024 ceasefire 15 months, the IDF did talk about striking drone production facilities in Lebanon. Now, what are these drone production facilities? They're not Rafael, right? They're not IAI. We're talking about a guy in his garage or in his bathroom making perhaps a single component, not the whole drone component. Go find that. Go put your finger on that. Go quantify that and then stop it. So there is difficulty. I'm not saying that it's just intransigence. There is a large part of it that is intransigence and unwillingness on the Lebanese side to do anything that may rankle Hezbollah or their support base, which isn't negligible. But there's also the difficulty in clamping down on this because of the way Hezbollah operates. So you have seams in Syria. You have money coming from Iraqi shrines, or Iraqi Shia shrines. Hezbollah has admitted this. You have money coming from the Houthis. And you might think, well, the Houthis, aren't they broke? But, the Zionist movement made a nation out of a bunch of broke people, right? So I wouldn't underestimate the broke, especially when you have, let's say you have 20 million supporters as the Houthis in Yemen, and you take $1 from each of them. That's $20 million. And a single dollar goes a long way in Lebanon, especially when you make war on the cheap and when you rebuild on the cheap. So you have all these things coming in. You have supporters in West Africa, Latin America, throughout the globe that, let's say I'm someone who's a Lebanese Shiite in West Africa. I'm doing well for myself. I feel the same gratitude towards Hezbollah that my cousin or whomever does in some village in South Lebanon. And I want to pay back to my community and to the people protecting my community and, and giving them domestic dignity and equality as I see it. I go down to a Western Union or a MoneyGram or any of these cash transfer organizations. I don't have to go through the banks. I put what, $3,000-$4,000? What's the maximum that goes under the radar? I have no flags on me. The other person who picks it up in Lebanon has no flags on them. Go track that, right? And that's not even to mention cryptocurrency. And so part of this issue is not just degrading Hezbollah. It's finding out all the ways that Hezbollah is regenerating and preventing that regeneration to keep them degraded. And that's the challenge, because without Lebanon's buy-in and active attempts, meaningful attempts to keep Hezbollah from regenerating, you're going to have these fissures that Hezbollah continues to exploit. Might take 10 years, might take 20 years. But what they're trying to do now, what they're trying to do now is not reach parity again with the IDF. They're just trying to restore their strength enough so that they can intimidate the rest of Lebanon, so that they can deter the rest of Lebanon from acting against them. That's not a tall order. That's a very small thing to do. So, when you have all these avenues, these trickles of funding, these trickles of weapons, it's all Hezbollah needs right now. So preventing that's the necessary precondition, and that's not what's happened. And it's out of the IDF's ability.
Now, you've said that Hezbollah, not Iran's nuclear program, is Iran's most valuable strategic asset. That might surprise a lot of people. Can you tell us why that is the case?
Well, let's look at what Iran's ideological goals are, right? It's not necessarily to have a nuclear weapon, right? That furthers the goal. That's not the goal in and of itself. Iran's objective is what has been called, and oversimplified in some ways, exporting the revolution. They want to project power outside of their borders. This doesn't mean to turn the entire region, the world, into, Khomeinist Islamists along the Iranian model. No, they want to exploit certain things within countries around them, certain factors within countries and territories around them, to set the region in a way that is favorable to Iran. Now, when you have a community like Lebanon, which is, you have You have a Shiite community there. They have historical grievances. They have historical fears from domestically vis-a-vis Israel. They were able to insert themselves and turn this into a base for Hezbollah to rise. So if exportation of the revolution is the end goal, is what Iran's objective under this Khomeinist regime is, you have to look at what is the entity, what is the component, what is the tool that has furthered this objective more than any. It's not been the ballistic missiles, right? The ballistic missiles, they've first deployed them in force, this time against Israel. They have caused damage in Israel, but it's not an existential threat, right? It's a strategic threat. The nuclear weapons, they don't have a nuclear weapon yet. And yet Iran has set the region on fire. Yet for over a decade, Iran was dominant in the region. And what is the critical component that led to that dominance? It's Hezbollah. Because if you look everywhere that Iran has gone, has projected power, has asserted control, Hezbollah has been there first. Obviously in Lebanon, right? And it's not an Iranian occupation insofar as Hezbollah are Lebanese and their supporters are Lebanese, which makes it much more difficult to kind of extract Hezbollah, because it's not like the PLO where you can push them out and tell them go to Tunisia, right? These people are locals. How are you going to get Lebanon to deport Lebanese citizens? That gives Iran an organic hold from within a country. So Lebanon first. But then you look at other territories where Iran has projected power. 2003, Iraq, the United States invades. After our invasion, Hezbollah rides the coattails of our invasion and builds up, by their own admission, by the admission of the Iraqi militias that arose to kill and fight American forces, Hezbollah rode on their coattails and went in and helped build these forces. You look at during the Second Intifada, Hezbollah was involved in strengthening Palestinian terrorist groups in Yehuda Shomron, right? In Gaza, after the Itnat after Israel withdraws from Gaza in 2005, by Hezbollah's own admission. This is an article that was run in Al-Akhbar, which is a leftist Lebanese pro-Hezbollah mouthpiece. Ahmad Moghnieh, who at the time in 2005 was Hezbollah's chief of staff, one of their most storied commanders, one of their legends, if you will, allegedly traveled to Gaza and helped build up the relationship, well, rather helped build up their rocket and tunnel warfare doctrine. And the relationship between Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas goes back even further to, if I'm not mistaken, December of 1993, when under the government of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israelis had exiled, deported something like 400 Hij and Hamas operatives to South Lebanon, and then under international pressure brought them back to Israeli-held territory. But during that time that they were in Lebanon, the linkage was created, and Hezbollah maintain that relationship. So you have projection into Gaza, you have projection into Yehuda Shomron, the West Bank, you have projection into Israel itself in some ways, right? There were, if I recall correctly, there were attacks that were furthered. I mean, Nassim Nasser was one individual. His mother was Jewish, father wasn't, had exploited Israel's law of return to come operate within Israel, or to move to Israel, and was operating on behalf of Hezbollah. You look at Bahrain, where the pro-Iranian opposition, Hezbollah was involved in building them up, the Houthis. Syria, obviously, where Iran felt an existential threat from the potential downfall of the Assad regime when the Syrian revolution started. Hezbollah was the first to fight. Hezbollah was there to put all the roadblocks in the face of the Syrian revolution until Iran could muster enough forces and bring in Russia to crush that revolution. Ultimately, they failed, ultimately, when Shah deposed Assad. But all these areas where Iran has projected power, Hezbollah has been there first. Their ability to project power in the region, their ability to enter countries, their ability to penetrate other countries and other areas has depended upon Hezbollah. You lose Hezbollah, you don't have a replacement, not a ready one, right? The Houthis, their ideological commitment to Iran is not what Hezbollah's is. Pidgin and Hamas really don't operate outside of the West Bank and Gaza. The Iraqi militias are still growing. They're still in their infancy relative to Hezbollah. So this is your major asset. This is your first to fight. This is the entity that goes in and lays the groundwork for everything that you do first. And you can't necessarily do it with the IRGC because there is Persian Arab suspicion, even among Shia. You need an Arab interlocutor. You need an Arab intermediary to do it. You need someone who understands the area a lot better than you do. This is where Hezbollah comes in. So you take out Hezbollah, this exportation of the revolution is severely damaged. Iran's regional hegemony, Iran's ability to project power into other countries, to exploit fissures in other countries, to basically seize segments of their population, and through that influence the foreign policy and domestic policies of those countries in a way that's favorable to Iranian policy, that is severely diminished. So you get rid of Hezbollah, Iran's in a lot of trouble, and they don't have an alternative right now. And I mean, look, what the ballistic and nuclear missiles are meant to do is to give an umbrella for the activities of these militias. The star of which is Hezbollah.
Now, does Hezbollah still take orders from Tehran, or has the relationship changed? Meaning, do they get every single action that they do? Is it coming from Iran, or is it just a general? Do we know what the relationship is right now?
So the relationship between the two sides has always been hierarchical but consultative, right? In the sense that they do, by their own admission, Hezbollah answer to the Wali al-Faqih as they see it, right? The jurisprudent ruler who is now Mujtaba Khamenei. And this is an ideological link. This is not dependent upon weapons or money. All the money and weapons could stop tomorrow. And Hezbollah would remain loyal to the person of Mujtaba Khamenei because of this ideological linkage. At the same time, Iran, look, this is what makes the Iranian model so dangerous. They take into consideration, especially when you're dealing with a proxy like Hezbollah, they take into consideration Hezbollah's needs, Hezbollah's domestic constraints, Hezbollah's internal constraints. So they're not going to force them to commit suicide. Right? They don't want them to commit suicide. Right now, Iran just played chicken with the United States in April, saying, hey, we're willing, effectively what Iran said then is, we're willing to have you continue this Israeli-U.S. war against us. We're willing to endure more pain if you don't stop the war in Lebanon. And it's not because of Lebanon. It's because of Hezbollah. They wanted to save Hezbollah. So that's how important this asset is to them. So, what you have is a situation where Iran may need something, and they'll go to Hezbollah and say, what can you offer within your current constraints? We don't want to push you beyond your means, right? Unless it's an emergency, unless it's something where the regime is an existential threat, and then the push isn't going to be that hard, right? Because Hezbollah views its fortunes as intertwined with this regime to a large part, right? Even if the regime fell, the way Iran has modeled Hezbollah is that it would still survive, but it would be greatly diminished. But beyond that, you have this ideological loyalty, you have this ideological linkage to the supreme leader in Tehran. You're going to do his bidding. You're going to ensure that he doesn't fall. So when Syria happened, for example, I think internally Hezbollah was probably like, we don't want to do this. We were not, our whole bread and butter is not built on going and killing fellow Arabs and Muslims. It's going to damage us. We're going to lose a lot. This is the first time Hezbollah went and fought offensively as a military for all intents and purposes. And you think of the political capital they burnt doing that, right? I don't think they wanted to do that, but at the end of the day, they saw that Iran viewed this as an existential danger. It was an existential danger as they understood it to them. So they went and fought. But Iran didn't say, go commit suicide, right? Give us what you can. We go to October 7th, for example, 2023. My sense, based on, there were a lot of Iranian officials that went and met with Hezbollah counterparts both before and after the war. And my sense is they said, okay, Lebanon's been in dire straits since 2019. There's been this economic collapse. You've had to walk a fine line between maintaining this strong resistance posture and not starting a war with Israel that makes you look like the person or the group that compounded Lebanon's economic misery with a major security conflagration. What can you do in this moment? And Hezbollah probably said, look, we can start harassing the Israelis, divide their attention on two fronts, and they probably won't respond on a massive scale. This is the way we can walk the fine line. And I think that's fine for Iran. Now, given what Hezbollah underwent at Israel's hands, both from mid-September, especially from mid-September 2024 to November 27, 2024, when Israel, for the first time in its history fighting Hezbollah, took the gloves off against this organization, right? You lose your top political leadership, your top military leadership. A lot of the mid-level commanders had already been killed in the low-intensity conflict that preceded mid-September, and also Israel continued to kill them in targeted killings after the ceasefire. So you have the chain of command is severely compromised. And what we saw is you have the Imam Hussein division and other components of the IRGC stepping in to fill the gaps, right? So I wouldn't necessarily put this as the IRGC is taking away Hezbollah's autonomy. Hezbollah's autonomy has been diminished because of the war, and Iran is stepping in to put Hezbollah back on life support, right, to help until they can fill in the gaps, because Iran prefers that Hezbollah has a degree of autonomy. Like you said, major decisions, there's consultation between both sides, right? It might come from Iran, it might come from Hezbollah. But on the minor decisions, I think they would rather leave the playing field, both domestically in terms of the politics, the society, and militarily, up to Hezbollah, because they're locals, they are Lebanese, they understand the country and its dynamics better than Iran can. And that also frees up a lot of resources for Iran that they don't have to sit there and expend to try to figure out like how to make this organization work in Lebanon. So I don't think this is ideal for Iran, right? Having to put Hezbollah on life support. I think they'd rather get it back to the point where they can function autonomously and resume this, again, hierarchical but ultimately consultative form of relationship.
How much support does Hezbollah actually have inside Lebanon? Is it more
Mhm,
support than the IRGC has in Iran? How much of that support comes from fear? How much of it comes
mhm.
from genuine belief in in that cause?
Mhm. So look, I mean, I'm not an Iran expert. I will suffice with saying that I think it is very difficult in a country like Iran to get real statistics, right? You're not talking about a democratic system where, or even an open system. Look, Lebanon is open field compared to Iran, right? Lebanon is a functional democracy after all, and Lebanese can, you know, say things to a large degree without fearing that their government is going to do to them what the Iranian government does to its people. There is no Lebanese equivalent of Evin prison, for example, and what goes on in Evin. So I think it's very difficult to determine what the degree of support the IRGC has in Iran. And look, my approach to everything in the Middle East, every actor in the Middle East, is skepticism. Even if they're on my side, against my side, I think you have to deal with skepticism. I think you have, sides. Each side has in Iran, each side has an interest in inflating their numbers. So I've seen different numbers from academic studies. It's unclear. I think we need to suffice with knowing that it's unclear. When it comes to Lebanon, we have a little bit more of an idea. Within Lebanon, look, it's not about how much support Hezbollah has overall, because Lebanon's political model doesn't function on an individualist basis. It functions on a sectarian basis, right? Lebanon is a sectarian power sharing agreement for all intents and purposes, right? More so than a country. You had, when the borders of Lebanon were drawn, in order to make, this initially Maronite French idea territorially viable, you had to include territories like Tripoli, like Beirut, like the Bekaa Valley, like South Lebanon, to make this territorially and economically viable. But at the same time, these weren't unpopulated areas. They included within them populations that did not have this buy-in into this concept of Lebanon, or that had historical enmity with the Maronites. I mean, you look at the Druze and the Maronites; they fought a civil war in the 1800s, where the Druze slaughtered Maronite villages left and right. So, and now you're telling these people that have historical hatreds, that have historical fears of each other, share power in this country, and let's include other people like the Sunnis who are like, well, we're Syrians. Since when are this Bilad Hashem? What's this Lebanon concept? And why should we live in a Christian-dominated area where we're going to have, a leg down? Also, are you sure the demographics in your favor? Because we haven't had a census since 1932, and even that census was shaky. So, you have Lebanon act as this power sharing agreement to get this buy-in. And what I liken it to a lot of people is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You have this structure that everyone believes is theirs, but no one has the ability or the numbers to take it over entirely, at least not yet. Who knows what will happen with demographic trends in the future. But so what you say is like, okay, well, you get this nook and you get that nook and you get this archway and you get, the foot of Jesus's tomb and you get the head of Jesus's tomb. And this is how Lebanon functions. So the Shiites get the Speaker of Parliament. They get certain appointments in Lebanon's security and military apparatus. And who does that go to? Or who gets to decide, who is appointed to those Shiite positions? Well, the most powerful parties in the Shiite community. And that is two parties, Hezbollah, number one now, right? We can go by 2022. I'll take you through the numbers if you want me to bore you. The 2022 legislative elections, we should have had a legislative election in May this year, but it was delayed for 2 years. But the last ones, Hezbollah won 356,000 votes. This was out of something like, 2 million votes cast, give or take. Right? It's not a negligible number. They won the most number of votes of any party by 150,000 votes. They didn't win the most seats because of the seat distribution mechanism. But by number of votes, 150,000 more than the second largest party in terms of number of votes, the Lebanese forces, the ones that we think of in the United States and the Israelis think of as their friends. Again, I wouldn't, but that's how they're perceived. And then Amal, if I'm not mistaken, the other Shia party came in third with 180,000. And Amal acts as basically the kosher stamp, the secular, relatively secular Lebanese nationalist Shia kosher stamp on Hezbollah. So together, you have like 500,000, give or take. And that's the elections. Now you go since then, because the argument has been, well, the war has weakened them. All right, well, January of 2024, a Washington Institute poll found something like 89 to 93% of Lebanese Shia support Hezbollah to some degree. Fast forward, September of 2024, Arab Barometer poll found that something like 85% of Lebanese Shia support Hezbollah to some degree, and only 5% don't, and 10% are like, we don't, no answer. And then you go to, Nasrallah's funeral in February 23rd of 2025, which Hezbollah had intended as a show not of its military force, but of its social force. Because one thing we need to understand is that it's not just Hezbollah's arms, it's not even primarily Hezbollah's arms that prevent its disarmament in Lebanon. It's this Shia support. And how many people came out? According to Information International, this is a Beirut-based consultancy group, politically neutral. They estimated, they took pictures, the pictures of the area where people had congregated, plus the stadium, Camille Shimon Stadium, which is Lebanon's largest. And they estimated that if 2 people stood per square meter, then 690,000 people showed up to that funeral. If 3 people stood per square meter, then it was 900,000 people. And that's not accounting for people that were in the balconies or standing inside of buildings. And they said that a maximum of 15,000 people could have come from, of those 690,000 and 900,000, could have come from abroad, foreign delegations, what have you, based on Beirut airport's arrivals, right, for that day. So they have the numbers, right? It's not a negligible number. Now, again, we don't know exactly how large the Shia sect is in Lebanon because there hasn't been a census since 1932, but it's estimated about 1.2, 1.5 million. And I like to tell people, well, not all, the remainder, let's say it was the lower number, 690,000 only showed up, and the other 1.2 million stayed home. Was that almost 50-50? Well, I like to tell people there was this massive rally in November of 2023, pro-Israel rally. Did all the Jews who didn't show up, were they anti-Zionist, or did they have other commitments, right? Did they have logistical problems with getting there? And in Lebanon, you have a country where these people have to, were they sick? Was their mother sick? Were they burying their dead? Were they taking care of the rubble? Like, you have a war where the connecting arteries of Lebanon were damaged, where these people are destitute, where they're displaced. So there could have been 1,000,001 factors that led to people staying at home. So I wouldn't estimate that all the people that didn't show up are anti-Hezbollah. Some of them are. There is an anti-Hezbollah opposition from the Shia community, but it is small and it is disunited. Then you go to the May 2025 municipal elections, Lebanon's first in something like 9 years, and Hezbollah with Amal swept the elections almost entirely. Right. So we've not seen, and even after the war, we don't have statistics yet that I've seen. And these statistics, by the way, maintain themselves all the way up to March 2nd of 2026, where Hezbollah restarted the war. And right since then, I've seen anecdotal evidence going both ways, right? Where we haven't seen massive Shia demonstrations against Hezbollah. We haven't seen this demonstrable break of people saying, you have ruined our lives. You did see protests against Iran throughout this period from among Shia, but notice they were pro-Hezbollah protests, right? So either way, you're in the Iranian camp, whether you realize it or not. If you're hating Iran because they abandoned Hezbollah and you're saying Labbaik Nasrallah, we're still on the path of Nasrallah, we're still on the path of Naim Qasim, well, what's the difference? So we're not seeing this massive break. Now, you ask the question, how much of it is hardcore conviction? How much of it is pragmatism? How much of it is fear? Hard to tell. Thanasi Kambanis did put out a book many years ago called Privilege to Die. And I accept his model, just having met Lebanese Shiites. Look, you probably have an inner core of Hezbollah, so these 85%, whatever it is, that 900,000 people, however much, the inner core are the hardened ideologues. They account for a minority. Right, but these are the people who are in Hezbollah's apparatus and the fighting cadres and the leadership cadres. These are the Khomeinists, right? As you go out, you might have people that are religious but not Khomeinist, and their interest in Hezbollah may be different than the Khomeinist ideologues. And as you go out further, you have kind of weakening ideological and religious commitment, and that's the bulk of Hezbollah's support, comes from people who, again, perhaps their lifestyle is indistinguishable from yours or mine. Perhaps you might even consider them in some ways politically moderate. on a range of things, or socially moderate, but they view Hezbollah, because of Lebanon's history and culture and historical dynamics, they view Hezbollah as the guarantor of their domestic equality in a system that has historically been stacked in the favor of Sunnis and Maronites and Druze, where they were, no matter how numerically large they were basically treated as second-class citizens, and as their guarantor against external threats, right? Jihadist groups and Israel. So that probably it's a clientelist pragmatic approach. It's not ideological. If someone else were to come offer them the same, they'd probably go for it. The problem is there is no alternative, and Hezbollah will never allow an alternative to grow. And look, I mean, you have such a thing as loyalty. Like, you see me wearing this England jersey now, right? Love England. They haven't won anything in 60 years. It's the World Cup is going on, and it's just pain and pain and pain. But I still support England, and England has never fed my family, right? The English national football team has never fed my family. They've never taken care of me. They've never protected me against outside aggressors as I see it, but I'm still loyal to them. How much more so to an entity or a group that I perceive of as having taken care of me one way or another? Now, is that right or is that wrong? Put that question aside for now. That's the perception. So the fear, look, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm sure there are Shia who do fall in line out of fear of Hezbollah. Hezbollah does hold considerable sway within Lebanon. Like, I go back to 2017, Hayy Sullum. This is a neighborhood in southern Beirut where these poor shopkeepers had set up unauthorized booths, cell phone booths and so on and so forth, in a neighborhood in South Beirut. This is Hezbollah's constituency, poor Shia. And then Hezbollah was part of this municipal cleanup project that got rid of their shops, their unauthorized shops. And you had people come out the next day and swear at Nasrallah and curse out Hezbollah. And Hezbollah used all of its means, including, social media pressure, including media pressure, including its influence within the state, to get these people back in line. And they all lined up within days. We're sorry. We apologize. We love you, Nasrallah. Now, does it ultimately matter whether it's fear or whether it's conviction if you line up? Because at the end of the day, the opposition is neutralized. And I think that's what we need to focus on, because there's nothing in Lebanon now. Right? First of all, we don't know the numbers, right? Do the people that sound like that, do they account for 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%? We don't know. I think there are people who are interested in inflating those numbers. But, you sit there and you dig down, like, give me numbers, give me statistics. I can't. But I can tell you the majority of Shia are anti-Hezbollah. Well, if you can't give me numbers, how can you tell me that, right? What's your scientific method? What's your methodology for understanding this? Give me data, just convince me. I've not seen convincing numbers in that direction. We've not seen convincing public demonstrations of that. We've not seen convincing polling, right? We've not seen, when it comes to elections, Nasrallah's funeral was perhaps the best attended in Lebanon's history, as far as we can tell. So Hezbollah can still get people to fall in line. I don't know how the numbers break down exactly, but if people are being honest, no one does either. What matters, though, is that they're falling in line.
Now, we're seeing tension between the White House and Israel over the fact that Israel is continuing to respond to Hezbollah's actions. Now, does Washington truly understand Hezbollah? Could America negotiate with Iran while allowing Israel to try to weaken Hezbollah? And could it be that American politics could end up saving Hezbollah in the end?
So look, the first question: do we understand Hezbollah? I don't know, right? I try to figure out what's behind the rhetoric sometimes, because the rhetoric suggests that we view Hezbollah and Lebanon as entirely distinct, right? Secretary of State of Marco Rubio, God bless him, keeps talking about Hezbollah as an enemy of Lebanon. When we look at the June 3rd ceasefire arrangement that came about between Israel and Lebanon, right? There was this idea that Hezbollah would evacuate its forces north of the Litani River. Well, what are you talking about? If you truly understand how Hezbollah operates, you realize that these people are locals. You're asking people and their families to basically Lebanon to displace. Again, this isn't a value judgment on whether they're good or bad guys. But the fact of the matter is, these people are locals to their villages. They have families. They have lives. They own houses in those villages. They are effectively Hezbollah's version, La'abdil, Kitot Konenut, right? So what are you talking about? If you truly understand Lebanon, you realize this isn't an evacuation process. Also, the Israelis don't seem to understand Lebanon, because they keep talking about Hezbollah as an Iranian occupation of Lebanon. And I get that this is convenient for the narrative, but if I go to a doctor, I don't want him to tell me if I have a tumor that I have a headache. right? I want him to diagnose me properly and treat me properly. So I don't know if the rhetoric reflects the proper understanding. If it does, then yes, we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble because we don't understand how Hezbollah operates. We don't understand Hezbollah's relationship to Lebanon. We've bought the propaganda of Lebanese activists on how Hezbollah operates within Lebanon. And that, look, does it make Hezbollah look worse? Sure, great. But, I'd rather not make them look like they're blood-sucking demons if I can achieve the end goal of defeating them, of disarming them. I think that should be the priority, right? Framing them accurately, even if it requires diminishing kind of this narrative we have, as long as the end goal is achieved, which is Hezbollah's disarmament. I don't think we gain anything by, making the problem look like an Iranian occupation, this nefarious Iranian occupation of Lebanon, if that does not diagnose a tumor as a tumor. So, and this will give Hezbollah room to regenerate. So that's part one. Will American domestic politics influence how Hezbollah is treated? Look, I don't know. I hope not. I think the tension right now that I see is, do we want Hezbollah disarmed more than we want whatever deal we're trying to broker with Iran? And again, look, I say this as someone who wasn't particularly supportive of the U.S.-Israel war with Iran. Not now. Not that I have any sympathy for the regime. I just didn't see it succeeding. At the same time, I realize what this regime is, and I realize that you can't come to a permanent modus vivendi with them because that is only a starting point for this regime to continue gobbling up through salami slices more and more and more and more. So if we want to come to a deal with Iran, recognizing that we're going to have to remain eternally vigilant with this regime, that's one thing. But to fool ourselves into thinking this quiet means peace, I would caution against that. Now, the question again is, do we want that quiet more than we want disarmament of Hezbollah? Because Iran wants Hezbollah to remain armed. Iran wants Hezbollah to survive. Iran wants the issue of Hezbollah's arms to be taken squarely back into the hands of Lebanon, where it realizes, like we talked, the social conditions have not ripened for Hezbollah's forcible disarmament. Right? They want this issue to go back into, the Byzantine maze of Lebanese politics, of the dialogue and consensus that President Owen and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam are still talking about right now, that failed for 18 years between 2006 and 2023 to do anything against Hezbollah. If anything, it was the pathway for them to grow, to become stronger, to become the threat that they posed to Israel on October 8th of 2023. And not just to Israel, by the way. I like to remind people, Hezbollah has placed the United States, it's placed us at the top of its hit list. They say that we are its primary enemy. Israel's just a tool, a forward military base. America's the primary enemy. So that needs to be kept in mind. And it's not just rhetorical. So the question is, what happens? And look, for me, the saving grace of this deal is the pilot zones. Right? The pilot zones where Israel withdraws from territory it occupies in South Lebanon, hands it over to the LAF. There's supposed to be verification mechanisms that ensure that the LAF takes effective control over this area, prevents Hezbollah from regenerating, eliminates Hezbollah's presence there to the extent that it can, right? Disarming, if you can't get rid of the fighters, at least disarm them and monitor them, keep them on probation, so to speak, for the foreseeable future. And if Lebanon fulfills its end of the bargain in that small zone, you give them another small zone, and then another small zone, and another small zone, until Israel finally withdraws from all territory it's occupying in Lebanon. If that's how it's going, and there's supposed to be verification mechanisms and, oversight from external parties, wonderful. This sounds great on paper. The question is whether, again, that tension, do we want Hezbollah disarmed more badly than we want quiet with Iran? And if the tilt is in the latter direction, I can see a situation where the pilot zones become cosmetic, where, a cursory laugh certification of disarming Hezbollah or clearing the area, again, like we saw on January 8th of 2026, becomes not, a pressure point against Lebanon. Hey, Lebanon, we think you're lying again, right? We think you're deceiving us again, but instead a pressure point on Israel. Look, Israel, they fulfilled their end of the bargain. Give them another piece of territory. Look, they fulfilled their end of the bargain. Give them another piece of territory. And what we're seeing from the Israeli side, look, Prime Minister Netanyahu's bread and butter. He went after Prime Minister Lapid at the time, or it was during the Bennett-Lapid government. I forget which part of the rotation it was. That one of the critical duties of an Israeli prime minister is to be able to say no to a U.S. president. That's nice in theory. It's kind of propaganda in practice. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been able to say no to President Trump for obvious reasons. You just don't say no to President Trump, not if you want the continuation of arms and more important than arms, the diplomatic support that the United States lends Israel. That is more critical than anything that Israel gets out of us. The backing, the moral backing that we provide the state of Israel. And, they've been willing to the Israelis have been willing to kind of take whatever we've dished out while framing it in such a way that doesn't align with the reality. You see Defense Minister Katz day in and day out come and say, we're staying in Lebanon, we're staying in Lebanon. To me, this is more, look, let's not forget, Israel has an election year. October 2026 it's not just President Trump that has an election to worry about, it's Prime Minister Netanyahu that has an election to worry about. And, on his watch, Mr. Security, the biggest security failure in the history of the state of Israel happened. And he wants to run again in the elections. He obviously wants Likud to win. He wants to resume the premiership. So he has to show that he's able to say no to President Trump and he's able to protect Israel's security interests. But on the ground, right, there's rhetoric and then there's what's happening on the ground, because we've seen consistent through line of when the United States says, we want this quiet with Iran, Israel, cut the game out that you're playing in Lebanon. Israel ends up exceeding. So will this happen? Will this dynamic prevail with the pilot zones? I don't know, right? It's against my nature to be optimistic, but I think what distinguishes this deal, a positive distinguishment of this deal from Resolution 1701, which is great law, from Resolution 1559, which was great law, from the November 27, 2024 ceasefire agreement, which, by the way, I think was better than the April 16th agreement that the Trump administration brokered, because it didn't put constraints on Israel's freedom of action in Lebanon the way the April 16th agreement did, right? November 27 said, Israel's right of inherent self-defense is preserved, no offensive military operations. That's it. April 16th said, preserving Israel's inherent right of self-defense in the face of imminent, ongoing, or planned attacks, meaning Hezbollah has to initiate, right? You take the initiative out of Israel's hands, you put the initiative in Hezbollah's hands. November 27th, basically serious violation of the ceasefire, meaning Hezbollah is regenerating, the LAF isn't taking care of it, Israel has the right to operate. So those are all great deals. They didn't work because enforcement was entrusted to Lebanon. The pilot zones seem to be taking that out, but let's see how it works in practice. Like, I need to see how this works in practice. Does it work to actually ensure that Lebanon is doing its job? Is this a method to put Lebanon's feet to the fire, to put up or shut up, as it were? Or is it a method to kind of just tick off the box and tell Israel, you know what, your security needs have been satisfied, get out already and stop this war once and for all?
David, I want to thank you for your time, for your insights, expertise. How can people follow you?
Well, I'd love to be on podcasts like this where we can have, nuanced discussions about this issue. I'm published. I'm writing a piece right now on the pilot zones and how they can be made effective. I intend to publish it in Haaretz. We'll see. Longboard Journal. I like to publish in Longboard Journal. That's a sister publication of FDD. That's where I kind of get into the nitty gritty of what's going on between Israel and Lebanon, kind of the technical military details, the wonky stuff. So I had a tracker of this, Israel's operations in Lebanon between November 2024 and March 2nd. That's on there. The road to the second Lebanon ceasefire. If anyone's interested in reading 2,400 words of me yapping on, and clearly I have no shortage of words. And just my media publications. I would also recommend that your viewers follow all of my colleagues at FDD. We all deal with different issues. And I trust in my colleagues that they're going to put out good information. So we're available for your followers and your listeners.
Amazing. Thank you again.
Thank you.